Hi, everybody. Welcome to YOSA Live Chats. I'm Music Director Troy Peters, and I am so happy to have you all with us today. We are joined today by Angélica Negrón. Angélica is a Puerto Rican-born composer and multi-instrumentalist, and quite honestly, her bio is so wide-ranging and imaginative that it's difficult to talk about everything she's done. On the one hand, she's in a remarkable electronic band called Balún that has been featured on NPR's Tiny Desk concerts and has been praised by critics all over the world. On the other hand, she's a composer who's written for groups like Bang on a Can, All Stars, the Brooklyn Youth Chorus, So Percussion, the American Composers Orchestra, and many, many others. Her music's been played at the Kennedy Center and the Ecstatic Music Festival and Bang on a Can Marathon and the New York Philharmonic Biennial. She is a remarkably all-encompassing musician, and I'm so happy to have Angélica Negrón with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Troy. It's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, so Angélica, we try to talk to our guests about their journey into music. So I'd love for you to think back to being a teenager, that time when you were 14, 15, 16 years old, and falling in love with music, learning about your own musicianship. How do you make the journey from there to being a teaching artist for the New York Philharmonic and having music played by the Dallas Symphony and those kinds of things? What was that journey like?
Well, I was born and raised in Carolina in Puerto Rico, which is a place that's very close to San Juan, and grew up in a small island full of music all around me. And played the violin since I was about 7 and a little bit of piano. And so I was in the conservatory, and I was also really into. I remember being a teenager and listening to a lot of Tori Amos, Bjork, Fiona Apple, and then going to the conservatory and then playing in the orchestra. And then I loved the violin, but I never saw myself as a concert violinist. I I was kind of very curious about other instruments, but I had no idea that composing was a thing or a possibility. So, because I always played music by dead white composers, and I never saw anyone that was writing music, any composers that looked like me, and I kind of started. I just really thought I was a really unfocused violin student, and because I didn't want to practice violin. I really wanted to stay in the harp room, record sounds with my tape recorder, and also learn how to play the cello. I bought an accordion. I was just teaching myself all these instruments, and I knew I was like, I love all of them equally, but I have to pick something to focus on. But I just didn't know that composing was a thing. So it was a lot of detours and a lot of existential crisis, and me trying to figure out what was it that I wanted. And because I didn't know what I wanted, I started, and I loved film as well. When I graduated high school, I at that time I was also starting to make music, but in bands. And I decided to study film at the same time that I was studying violin, and it was not because I felt like I needed something else to make money, or like the cliche of like having a second profession. Definitely film was not gonna be that. It was another arts profession, but it was just I was really curious about film and film music too. So I was doing 2 undergraduate degrees at the same time and studying violin in the conservatory in Puerto Rico and studying film in the University of Puerto Rico. And about 2 years into that, and then I started Balloon, also very early version of Balloon, in which it was mostly electronic, just like vintage Casio keyboards and a CD player. And so I was very active in the DIY scene in San Juan, playing a bunch of shows, and making music with friends, mostly friends not from the conservatory, actually friends from the university. And and as I was studying film and I was studying music, I discovered composing. And it was mostly through, I remember there was this friend of mine that was studying composition, and so he told me about it. He knew that I was not really that my calling in life was not a violinist. And I also remember there was a friend of mine that was playing the Shostakovich violin concerto, and I became obsessed with it. I would sit outside of his practice room and just listen to him. And Shostakovich was long gone by then, but that was the closest thing to something contemporary that I heard. So I really became obsessed with Shostakovich, Stravinsky, Schnittke, all the Russians. And I remember at that time, very close to the conservatory, there was a Borders, and used to go there during my breaks. There used to be the booths where you could listen to music, and Bang on a Can had a bunch of records there. So I remember listening to a lot of Julia Wolf, Michael Gordon, and also discovering Kronos, and listening just obsessively to those records. And I have a very vivid memory of trying to find this George Crumb, the Black Angel score in the library at the conservatory, and that being something kind of impossible, but then finding this huge score that I wasn't able to fit in the copier. And just those moments really just made it very clear to me that what I wanted was to write for other people. And I still continue to perform mostly in Balloon, and but then switched to composition and never looked back. Just continued making music with Balloon, and continued writing music for the concert hall. And at that time, keeping things very separate, which later on changed. But that's another story.
That's very cool. How did you find your way to New York? Were there stops in between, or what was that journey about?
I moved right from Puerto Rico to New York to pursue a master's at NYU. And because I was studying film and music, for me, and I loved film music, for me it made a lot of sense to come here and pursue a master's in film music. But I was also very naive about what that entailed, and I made a mistake that turned out to be a kind of happy accident. I didn't realize that you had to apply for a separate track in film music. I just applied to composition and assumed that that would mean that I could focus on film scoring, but it was two separate tracks. So when I got here, I realized that I was studying composition, not film music. But what I did was I took all my electives in film scoring, and then continued to write for the concert hall, which is actually, I would say, 70% of what I do now. So I'm very grateful of that happy accident, because it's kept me writing music for projects that don't necessarily involve something visual.
Right. Well, and then, one of the things that most young musicians, especially most young composers that I know, journey through is that question of how to make ends meet, how to put together a career, how to build a career. And we actually have a question from, now my Spanish is not great. So this might be an idiom that I'm not familiar with, but we have a student, David Escamilla, who asks, ¿Cómo puedes tocar música, pero con agua y comida? Comida.
¿Cómo puedo tocar música con agua y comida? How can I play music with water and vegetables? And food, actually. I use vegetables, so I'm gonna do a little preface to that answer, because it has to do with what I was talking about before in terms of Balloon and where I'm at right now. And as I said, I had those two things very separate. I wouldn't even tell my friends in the conservatory that I was playing a show in a venue in Old San Juan. It was just two separate lives. And when I was in the conservatory, I was writing what I thought was what I was supposed to write. So something that looked complex on the page, or at that time I was really influenced by Russian composers. So I kept those two very separate. But when I moved to New York, and actually after I finished my master's, I spent a year between my master's and my doctorate writing music that I was not showing to anyone. And during that year, it was kind of a aha moment of finally, it was the first time I was writing music for myself. And I was not caring about what the score looked like. I was just caring about how it sounded. And I usually just did what I thought was the composer thing of sitting at the piano and then writing things by hand and then putting them into Finale on the computer. But I remember being really stuck on this piece. I was writing drawings for Miyoko. And then in that moment, out of desperation, really, I decided, what if I open, instead of finale, or if I write by hand, what if I open Fruity Loops, which is a software that I was using before, mostly as a sequencer, because I didn't really like the sounds that it came with, but I loaded my own samples and I was making ambient music a lot with it, and that's also what Balún used in the early days to make music. It's also very popular in Puerto Rico because everyone that makes reggaeton uses Fruity Loops. So I was like, what happens if I just open Fruity Loops and then try to write a piece and then make it like the things that I do with my solo ambient project and with Balún, but it just happens to be for a Debussy trio. And and the piece was like, it was so easy, and I was not thinking about the score. I was super excited about it. I was going back to listen to it, and that really was a moment that for me made me realize that I just needed to write the music that I wanted to write. It sounds like the most obvious thing for a composer, but it took me so long to get to that point. And it took me to be out of school to realize that and not have that pressure of academia. And all of that as a preface to say that at that moment, I was also incorporating a lot of electronics in my music. And I realized that if I wanted to incorporate electronics in my music, I wanted the performance of the electronics to also be really engaging and not, I wanted it to add like another level to the performance too. I didn't want it to be just like someone hitting spacebar on a computer, or and that's how I started to explore more unconventional interfaces to new instruments and collaborating with instrument builders to try to perform music with things that feel like there's some mystery or magic behind the sound. And then there's also the physicality of, you can see when I dip my finger into water that it triggers something, or when I touch an artichoke that you get this low bass note. So, and switching now to Spanish, realmente fue el proceso de comprometerme a que mi música iba a tener mucho que ver con electrónica pregrabada, lo que me llevó a tratar de explorar otras maneras de llevar esos sonidos que no vienen de un instrumento tradicional como el violín o un vibráfono, sino que salen de una máquina, a ver cómo traducirlos de una manera que la gente como que invite a la gente y se sienta que hay cierto misterio, cierta magia detrás de los sonidos, y que a la misma vez rompa un poco con los esquemas de lo que la gente piensa con la música electrónica, que es algo apartado y que es algo como difícil o complicado, y que solamente ciertas personas que tienen cierto conocimiento lo pueden hacer, sino que también algo que la gente se sientan que puede ser algo simple, juguetón, y que los invite a seguir su curiosidad y explorar otras maneras de traer música en vivo.
Exactly. Well, so you mentioned Fruity Loops, and that drives me to a question that I think about a lot. Honestly, in the pandemic, I've been learning Logic Pro X for the first time, and I've known about digital audio workstations, or DAWs, for years, and I've been in studios where I've looked over somebody's shoulder while they were working in Logic or while they were working in Pro Tools. I've been around students who are working with Fruity Loops or with Ableton, and I had some understanding of the mechanism, but I had no fluency with the tool. And now I'm learning that perspective, and I'm really intrigued to think of young composers starting in a DAW rather than starting with notation or starting at a piano keyboard. I can already feel my own songwriting changing, and certainly when I look at mixing and producing the music that my band's been working on, it just changes the way the space of music is organized in my head, right? I move out of bar lines to a degree, and I move definitely into a space where pitch is just one parameter, and doesn't have the same primacy that it has with the conservatory education that I grew up with as a composer. So it's a long prelude to this question of what do you think of, you started in going into that space of working in Fruity Loops. do you go back and forth between those spaces? Do you start pieces more in the world of a DAW, and notation is a later step of the process, or sometimes not even a part of the process? Or how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting process for me, and how, and precisely what you were talking about, how it's affected my compositional process, the speed in which I write music, the attachment I have to pieces. I My first explorations with that technology was with DAW was mostly with Fruity Loops, and that was I think for over like maybe 2 or 3 years, and then I switched to Ableton mostly out of necessity because I was starting to score some films, and it was just I just couldn't get a video into Fruity Loops, so I just started exploring Ableton. And this was about 10 years ago, and really Ableton has been my primary composition tool since then, to the point that now even if I'm writing a piece for orchestra, I'm on Ableton. There's something about the workflow of it, and how simple it is, the colors, that for me it makes me want to compose, and it's way less intimidating than the blank page. So my process usually starts, and because I'm mostly writing oftentimes for electronics along with acoustic instruments, I mostly start with collecting sounds, so recording either on my phone with a little H5 Sony recorder, and oh, why did I say Sony? It's not Sony, it's a Zoom, the little Zoom H5, and so collecting sounds either from the environment, from my kitchen, sometimes from rehearsals with the performers. I recently wrote a piece for the San Francisco Girls Chorus, and part of the electronic sounds that I used for them, that a percussionist played live using a sampling pad, was voices that were sampled in rehearsals with them when we were gathering material and the piece was not yet composed. So this idea of like collecting sounds and building a sound library that slowly starts kind of taking shape, and giving me what the sound world of the piece will be. And so I start with that, and usually if the piece has electronics, I'm very drawn to textures and and specific sounds. And so I start manipulating those recordings, and finding the sounds in the sound library that will make it as part of the piece. And then I work kind of going back and forth between the acoustic instruments and the electronics. So it's always I'm always in the screen, which is something I always thought I was something that I shouldn't do. That there's this kind of I would say like an idea of like the composer being at the piano, or the composer being validated by a process that is very connected to the canon, which, to be honest, doesn't represent me or doesn't look like me. So why would their process fit my process right now? So it took a little bit of of self-assessment, and letting go of those pressures that I was putting on myself, mostly because of school and academia, and to just let go of those things and be like, what is the thing that I enjoy the most? What is the thing that gets the ideas that I have here closer to the performers? And for me, that meant being in Ableton most of the time. And sometimes I have ideas before I start writing the piece, or while I'm writing the piece, and I record them on the voice memos. And or sometimes I'm walking my dog, and then I start singing things and I record them. Sometimes I take on my violin. It's rare, but sometimes I take out my accordion. Is actually more likely that I'll come up with a melody there. So it fluctuates, but most of the time I'm on Ableton, and then with a little music notebook like this. I have two of them, and just like sketching ideas and rhythms. But for me, it really works. I teach a lot of very young composers too. So as a teaching artist for the Philharmonics, for the New York Phil's program, very young composers, and I also see the dangers of starting right away if at such an early age with DAW. So for me, what's helped in my music is to always be really intentional about the choices I make, and never let the software dictate an artistic choice I make. And if I can figure out how to technically do something, just write a note, a post-it, put it there, and then get back to it at another time, but never compromise what I have in my head. And for example, it's if I'm always like going between Ableton and then to Finale, and it's from MIDI to exporting, like importing those into Finale. So I've gotten really good at quantizing as I'm working and making sure that my rhythms are tight, so it's not a mess when it goes to the score. But when like changing time signatures, it's the thing that it takes a lot of work. So I have to remind myself constantly that that I shouldn't stick to the grid. That there's also all these possibilities. That even though it's not the easiest in my main composing tool, that I should always go for what I want and then figure out how to technically do it later, but never compromise my ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's very shop talky for me, because I'm a composer, it's something that I'm really interested in. But, I, in some ways, I think your generation of teachers and my generation of teachers, who were your teachers in some ways, did focus on that idea that you need to start in your head or at the piano. But in a way, the piano is a previous generation's DAW. I mean, it is a tool where you can discover sound and manipulate it and play with it. It's not as if there's a purity to that tool that makes it superior to another musical tool where you can discover sounds and manipulate sounds and explore their possibilities. So it seems like a really natural next step. And I'm really intrigued by seeing young composers who are creating vibrant and powerful music with this tool that, is a new world to me. So I'm hoping to catch up, chasing after.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it responds to the lifestyle that I have. I'm usually traveling a lot, so this is just way more practical for me, and I have everything I need here, and I can go up and down octaves. So just I'm not when I'm traveling. I'm not in in the suite with the grand piano.
Right.
Exactly. I'm also not a pianist, so
right.
Why force myself to something that, yeah, it's just, I think it's these kind of ideas that that could be very powerful depending on who you study with and the buildings that you study in the institutions, that just and especially if you, like, as someone that came from Puerto Rico to study composition here, and as a Latina trying to make a career in the US as a composer, I think the first years that I was here was a lot of like me trying to be like, oh, this is what we do, or this is how things are done, just so I could feel in some way validated as an artist. But that's just it's just not who I am, and it really took a while for me to understand that the only way I could feel validated, which the main thing for me at right now, my age is 39. Right now, for me, being validated starts with myself. If I feel like happy with something and I'm excited about something and I feel passionate about something, then that's enough. But it took me a while to realize that can only come from a place of being genuine to what you want to hear, to who you are, and embrace the process that just works for you. There's no right or wrong. It's just what works for you.
Right. Well, and audiences are responding in all of the worlds you travel in musically to the authenticity and originality of your voice. Right. You're telling your story musically in a way that people are responding to, and I think that's the proof that this is the right path to be on. We have questions from JD Estrada, who asked, was it hard to find the perfect caldero for some of the beats? And then he also asks about any news on a new album and any other Caribbean influences that you might be exploring.
Great questions. Wow, they're so prepared. And it looks like they've seen some videos of me showing some of my found sounds. I love using sounds from my kitchen, and I have really great sounding calderos of different sizes. So it was not hard. It was super easy because they're in my kitchen. I've recorded those calderos with so many different mallets, so many different attacks, with just exploring them in different ways, and they always sound different. But I love playing with bell-like sounds. So calderos, if you hit them with a mallet, I love especially yarn mallets, make it the resonance really beautiful. I love playing with taking out the attack, so the hit of the note, and just leaving the resonance. And I construct a lot of my pads that way, because the resonance, it's this fluctuating pitch that it's never quite in tune. And I love that when my music is pretty melodic, and I would say for new music very accessible in terms of the harmonies. And I love melodies, and I love pop music, and I pretend to hide that. So I love when in my electronics there's something that's always a little off, and it's often because my sounds come from found things in my kitchen, and they're never like right in tune. So yeah, just I it's easy for me to just go into my kitchen and record. I just record a bunch, and then I have those as different libraries, and when I start a piece, I just look for those, or usually remember which ones I want. Or if I can't find the sound I'm looking for, then I go to my kitchen again and try a different mallet, or a different way of playing it, or a different pot, or anything I can find. And then the second part was about Caribbean influences, right?
Yeah, and a new Balún album, I think, maybe.
Oh yeah. So we have a bunch of new songs with Balún, and we're hoping to record at least an EP this year. Fingers crossed. Things are being, of course, a little tricky with people in different places in the world. We have part of the band in Puerto Rico and the other part in Brooklyn. Now one of our band members moved to North Carolina, so we're figuring out the best way to do that. But we're hoping to be able to put out new music very soon. And in terms of Caribbean influences, I love that question, because I grew up always hearing that my music didn't sound Puerto Rican, or even like when I moved here, that like people were like, "Oh, where are you from?" And then when I would say Puerto Rico, a lot of people were like, "Oh, you don't look Puerto Rican, or you don't sound Puerto Rican," and like I thought you were from like Spain or from Argentina or Chile, and there's a lot to unpack there, and I won't go into that. But there's also this kind of identity crisis that I think I've felt for a long time in my music. And when you're in a place that's not your home, and you're being programmed and commissioned by other people, or by people that you represent another to them, it's you're viewed always through that lens. And some people are really aware of it. Some people want you to bring in your, like, perform your Latinidad, and in a way that might not be what you want to say in that piece, or even if it's a big part of your work. And so that's always for me been a big struggle, and well, something that I thought about a lot. And I feel like the more I'm here, this July, it's the 14th anniversary of me moving to New York. So the more I'm here, the more I embrace the fact that, especially because of the complex relationship of Puerto Rico with the United States as a colony, there's identity. It's just there's so much multiplicity in that word, for everyone. But for me, musically and personally, it's just something that it's not, you're not gonna hear it in a clave, in the percussion in my orchestral piece. It just doesn't come out that way. There might be an underlying clave in the vegetable patterns that I'm playing in my electronics, that it's part of me. It's part of how I grew up, and it's a big part of my identity, but it's one part of it, and there's so many other things that I'm interested in. However, that said, also when you move away from the places that you call home, that there's also this kind of it's not limited to nostalgia, but it's this thing of wanting to be closer to those spaces. So at least in Balloon, that's been really when we moved here, where we started embracing more of those rhythms, especially the dembow that comes from reggaeton, which has, for me at least, has, because I'm from Carolina, the place that where that was born. It's been just constantly present in my life, and when you're immersed in it and you're listening to Bjork or Tori Amos, then you kind of want to separate yourself from that. But when you move away from it, in my case, it had the effect of like looking at it from another perspective, and feeling like, oh, this is actually a really cool beat, and there's so much more that you can do with it. So I've been with Balloon, we've been exploring a lot of that dembow rhythm, and in Balloon there's also folk instruments from the island like cuatro and tiple. That's always been a part of our music because of the friends and musicians that we make music with. They come from those traditions, and they were a little hidden before. Now they're a little more upfront. And in my own music, I would say that it's I'm really interested in playing with preconceived notions of what people think Latinidad is and what a Latina composer is supposed to be. I always joke that some commissioners sometimes think that I can write a piece and then sprinkle adobo on the piece, and then just it will give it some sabor, and that's not how things work. So I just finished the piece actually for Detroit New Music, and it's called "Say Something in Spanish." And so I'm really interested in playing with with my journey as a Latina composer, navigating mostly white spaces in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, and what I can say to that in a way that what I can say about my experience in a way that feels authentic to the music that I want to write.
Wow, that's so cool. I love the idea of confronting and subverting that expectation, because I mean, yeah, I can only imagine there must be times where people are, wanting to haul out the congos and the maracas,
Mm-hmm.
and just assuming that there are elements that will be part of the Negron package.
Right. And the other extreme of me being, this Puerto Rican with purple hair and writing electronic music with unusual instruments, and being like, oh, she's not like them, kind of thing. So
Right.
these two extremes of, and me being like, I could be, I could, play my vegetables. I could also love Selena and
Right.
Ricky
Right.
Martin too. Like they're not mutually exclusive. And I can also be many things in between, like all of us are. So that's really important for me to confront and my music too.
Well, I think that's a really, really important thing for young musicians to have validated, because I think so often in our education we are foisted into these strata of, this is the art music, and this is the
Mm.
pop music, and this is the party music, and this is the music that has scores and is therefore more important. um, and I love hearing you talk about, spending time with that giant George Crumb score, right? That's an important part of the journey for all of us. But I think it's really important for young musicians to know and be reinforced the idea that Selena is absolutely rich and meaningful, and don't be ashamed of that. And yeah, or the
And she's one of the reasons why I write music,
right, right,
as much as George Crumb is and John Cage.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I'm
And
older,
Tania
so
Leon.
for me it's Prince, but it's absolutely, this thing of the way that we connect with these different streams in our lives. Another question from David Escamilla, which is, what advice do you have for young people who want to be like you? What if I'm a young musician and wants to follow the path that you're blazing? What should I be doing now?
I think it's important for you to take a deep look at what you really love doing, all the things, and maybe even a deeper and closer look at the things that you might be suppressing or ignoring or keeping on the low because they don't fit into some spaces that you're usually in. Um, and this happens so much for musicians that are studying classical music, and then explore and play with all those tools and all those sounds that come and that live in those spaces that seem like they're in different and separate containers, but it's all imaginary. They could all just spill out and make something beautiful. They don't have to exist in separate things. So and I think I at least from seeing my young composer students now, I feel like that's less of an issue than it was when I was growing up. So I'm super happy that those boundaries are being demolished, and but it's still a thing. So I would just encourage you to be your authentic self and do the things that you love. It sounds like something very simple, but at least in my own personal journey, it took me a while to fully embrace everything of who I am, and not be apologizing for things or being like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this super simple progression in this piece because it's not gonna be interesting to talk about in the composition seminar. Who cares about that? Really, just write the music you want to write, play the music you want to play, make music with the people that you want to make music with and that fill you with joy. And when you find joy in something, just do more of that.
So great. And I would encourage all of you to go check out Angelica's music. If you go to angelicanegron.com, there's a link to her SoundCloud and all kinds of recordings of her concert works. And if you check out Balún, Balun, there is a whole rich body of music there, and they're on all the streaming services. The Tiny Desk concert is great. And the Tiny Desk concert includes a mutual friend of ours, a YOSA alum, Darian Thomas. And I just wanted to shout out Darian. How did you meet Darian? What's that journey like?
Darian is one of my favorite people in the world right now. Darian sent me a cold email saying he loved my music. The piece that I was talking about earlier, that was the first one I did with Fruity Loops, Drawings for Mayoko. He was talking about how that piece kind of was a big moment for him in his realization of what he wanted to do musically as a composer. And we met at that time. I lived in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, and we met at a coffee shop and just clicked. And then after that, I think I had some string arrangements for Balloon, and we wanted someone to play live in the release party, so I invited Darren to play in that. Then it's like once you have Darian, then you don't want to let go of Darian. So it's interesting. I mean, I feel like, and it was just here. We also live close by. I'm very lucky that we live close. But I was remembering how we started when we met. It was because he was someone that admired my music, and now whenever I'm stuck on a piece, the first person I call is Darian, and in like 5 minutes, it's always like I just play him what I have, and then it's not a lesson. It's just like a very casual, informal listening session, and in 5 minutes, he just like, why don't you just forget about bar lines here and just open up the whole texture? And I'm like, oh, and then. So very wise for his age, for sure, and brilliant, and also generous person. Yeah. So very grateful to have him in my life.
And for YOSA musicians who don't know Darian, you'll get to know Darian. He's an alum, and he weaves in and out of the life of YOSA all the time. I will just share that the reason I know your music is because of Darian. That, when he was still an undergraduate student, and he had been taking some composition lessons with me from time to time, he came and said, "You've got to hear this music," and introduced me to your work, and I've been a fan ever since. So I love that I love the small world that's in music. There's so many wonderful things in our musical lives that come from these associations we form, these friendships that we form, and also the way that mutual friends can bring us together. Can you talk to us? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say that I also, when you approached me to do this, the first thing that I thought of was like, if this is what was the main thing that shaped Darian as a musician, this has to be something amazing. So it also makes me really happy as an educator and also as someone that had a very different experience growing up playing in youth orchestras. It makes me so happy that things like this exist and make musicians like Darian thrive because it's so important.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, we're all very proud of him. Can you talk to us about what you're working on now? I mean, this is a strange time. We have to acknowledge that we're in this bizarre time for all creators where we don't, premieres have been postponed and
Yeah.
everything's in flux. But with that said, where are you headed next in the next few years? What new horizons do you want to explore as a composer or as a performer? What's going? What are you dreaming about as a musician right now?
I love that question. So much more than what are you working on now too. Even though all composers love to talk about what they're doing, that's me included. But I've been thinking a lot about that because uh, I I come from a place that I didn't really. There's not really a culture of playing new music. Um, so I had to be like to my friends that were playing with me in orchestra, can you please play my thing? Can you please play my thing? And I moved to New York and I was, can you please play my things as a student? And then from there to now, in which I'm getting paid to write music, it's still for me a kind of shock. And I'm always like grateful and be like, do you want to pay me to write you some notes? That's amazing. But now that I'm getting more work and I have to be more selective, I've had to think a lot about that, about what do I want to say in my music and where do I feel like I'm headed next. I'm right now writing a piece for the Dallas Symphony, and next year I'm going to be writing 3 orchestral pieces too. So there's a lot of orchestral things that have come my way, and I love that. But I am really, really interested in continuing to write vocal music. Last year was a big vocal year for me, and I want to do more of that for chorus, for opera too. There's an opera that it's my passion project that I started 2 years ago and that I put on the side because it's the one thing that it's not a commission, it's just the thing that I'm really passionate about. But I'm starting actually as of tomorrow, in which I have a few meetings about it. I'm bringing it back, and because it's the thing that really fills me with joy and that I feel like needs to get out in the world. And it's a lip sync opera for drag queens and chamber ensemble. So I'm gonna be working on that next year along with the orchestral pieces. So I think next year will be for me a lot about large scale projects, which is a little scary because it's not one, it's a few simultaneous. But we will see what happens.
Well, and I think I think I've talked to several composers who are struggling with the schedule shifts that are happening as a result of the pandemic. Sometimes mean you might have a traffic jam a year or from now or 2 years from now.
Certainly feeling that. I was doing my writing schedule. I had it until December, and then I was like, I should do it till next year just to see how things plan out. And I realized quickly that that traffic jam is very real because I was supposed to be finishing right now a piece for the LA Phil. And that's moved to next year, and that's a big one. And I had an unexpected but really fun commission for Kronos this April, which was for a piece to be performed via Zoom, which was a whole nother interesting challenge. And it felt a little bit for me like a joke because this is one of the quartets that I love so much. One of the reasons why I write music. And I felt like it was a cruel joke of, you're going to write a piece for Kronos, but it has to be performed over Zoom. But I did it, and we recorded it, and it's going to be out hopefully in the next few weeks. and so that was something unexpected that was not on the schedule, but then because of the LA Phil thing shifting, I was able to do that. And then now I have a film score that was not also in the plans. It's just things are moving because priorities are different, and some things can continue, some things can't. There's now a lot more invitations to write solo pieces too, which I love writing, but trying to see where those fit in the schedule.
Right. Well, I wish you the best with all of that. It was such a delight to chat with you today, Angelica, and I really appreciate you being here. And I know that your words and your music will be an inspiration to a whole generation of musicians here in San Antonio who, are looking for people who look like them, for people who are out there making great music and forging a career in a space that hasn't had as many Latina composers as it should. Thanks for writing great music, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the awesome work that you do. Well, and thanks to the students for the questions too. Those were great questions too.
Yeah, we're pleased to have you here. Well, that's it, everybody. That actually is our last YOSA live chat in this run this summer. We're gearing up to come back into starting our season, and although we may not be able to have everybody together in person right away, we're going to start working together with as many musicians as we can and try and get ourselves ready so that when the day comes that we can be back together, that we're already moving forward and making music together. So thanks again, Angelica. Thanks to all of you who are with us today, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.